Ben Austen writes for New York Times Magazine, Harper's, and a host of other publications. In his riveting book, High Risers, Cabrini-Green, and the Fate of American Public Housing, Ben tells the story of residents who struggled to make a home for their families as powerful forces converged to accelerate the demise of the Cabrini-Green public housing complex in Chicago. He explores the state of public housing amid the changing forces of American cities and the shifts in federal public policies and funding. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ben Austen.
So I'm honored to speak here. I'll say, first of all, the important work of this organization, and really many of the people here, have influenced and informed my own work. In 1956, Dolores Wilson and her family moved into a brand new public housing high-rise at Cabrini-Green on Chicago's near north side. They were assigned an apartment on the 14th floor, and everything smelled of fresh paint. Dolores had never been that high in the sky before. She stepped onto the ramp, the open-air walkway outside her apartment, and clutched the chest-high fencing in terror. That was the first day. But soon she was delighting in her lordly view of Chicago's rippled skyline. She sat out there, enjoying the breeze, her 5 children playing alongside her. It was the project, she'd say, by which she meant it was clean and safe and spectacular to behold. Before that, the Wilsons had lived on the city's south side in what was called the Black Belt. In a one-room basement apartment. It had a single window opening onto an alley and a bathroom down a hallway that they shared with another family. The children slept on a pull-out couch on one side of the room, and Dolores and her husband Hubert in a bed along the opposite wall. With that arrangement, I'm not sure how the last child ever got made, Dolores told me with her wry humor. The Wilsons had tried to find a better apartment in the private market. They saw buildings with rotting wood and missing bricks, and apartments chopped up into multiple kitchenette units. Or landlords simply turned them away, telling them that they had too many children. On the south side, Dolores lived in constant dread that the structure meant to house her family might actually be killing them. An eviction could come at any time. Maybe her children would catch pneumonia or tuberculosis or eat the crumbling paint and plaster. Her greatest fear was that the building would go up in flames. But at Cabrini-Green, the walls were solid cinder block. It was fireproof, she'd say. Even the smoke couldn't get in there. It was like heaven. Dolores Wilson is one of the 4 Cabrini-Green residents whose life I chronicle in my book, High Risers. Another is the incredible Willy Jr Fleming, who's sitting over here. He was part of a panel yesterday. JR, a bootleg merchandise king at Cabrini-Green in the 1990s, specializing in knockoff Bulls championship gear. He went on to fight to save Cabrini-Green as an activist, and truthfully, after that battle was lost, to figure out other solutions for low-income housing elsewhere in Chicago. The history of Cabrini-Green and public housing's rise and fall, or high-rise public housing's rise and fall, is also the story of our always uneasy relationship to poverty and to race. That story isn't just about Chicago, it's about every city in America, and it's really about America itself. Consider when the country first started investing in public housing 80 years ago. Then, as now, the idea of government-run housing was attacked as socialist, anti-capitalist, un-American. It was seen as clashing with an exalted sense of home ownership, with a national ethos wrapped up in visions of the frontiersman, the log cabin, and the self-made entrepreneur. The shortcomings of the for-profit real estate market were evident then in record shortages of housing, in eviction riots and homeless encampments, and cities overrun with blighted slums. And yet, The legislation to create public housing was opposed by real estate groups, property owners associations, and nearly enough politicians to derail the law. It seems telling that the first public housing complexes were established alongside the federally insured private home loan. This revolution in financing allowed owners to put down as little as 10% of a home's cost and pay it off in small increments over 30 years. Even today, the federal government devotes 3 times as much each year to subsidies to the speculative real estate market than to the entire budget of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Dolores Wilson went on to make a home for herself at Cabrini-Green. At her children's school, she joined the PTA, first as treasurer and then as president. She attended a local Lutheran church, serving on its board. There was a community center funded by the city's welfare council, and that's where she took her kids to dance and music classes. She was part of a parents group and a social club that met there. She volunteered with a local Democratic organization, walking her high-rise to get out the vote. This was Chicago under Old Man Daley's political machine. And when a bundle of patronage jobs were being divvied up, she got one at the city's water department. She worked there for 27 years. Her husband got a job at Cabrini-Green, not as a janitor, as Dolores Wilson has corrected me many times, but as a maintenance worker. Cabrini-Green was not without problems even from the start, of course. It was a lower income, working poor neighborhood in the throes of racial turnover. On just 70 acres, there were some 20,000 people, as many as most towns or suburbs, but with almost none of their resources. Yet Dolores and her neighbors formed committees to deal with juvenile delinquency, vandalism, and under-resourced schools. She helped throw a birthday party for her building each year. She lived in 1117 North Cleveland, so the party took place every November 17th. Decades later, when the roof of her high-rise leaked, gang signs covered the walls, apartments were boarded up, and garbage collected on the landings, she led the resident group that took over the building's management duties. They collected rent, screened tenants, headed up security, and oversaw a multi-billion-dollar rehab. Cabrini-Green's location made it an anomaly in segregated Chicago. Its 23 towers and 3,600 units were on the near north side, a few blocks from the ritzy Gold Coast and Michigan Avenue's Magnificent Mile. Near north, near everything, Dolores would sing. That proximity to wealth and status also added to its infamy, making it the country's most iconic housing project. Mayor Jane Byrne moved into one of the towers at Cabrini-Green in 1981 as a political stunt because her luxury condo was a couple of blocks away. Cabrini-Green became the setting of the TV sitcom Good Times, the movie Cooley High, dime novels, documentaries, rap songs, and endless news stories. If you stubbed your toe at Cabrini-Green, it was in the news, Dolores Wilson would say. There was a recurring Saturday Night Live skit in the 1980s about a teenage single mother. Her name was Cabrini-Green Harlem Watts Jackson. The public housing project had made it onto a Mount Rushmore of scariest inner city places. It was the embodiment of those fears. In the horror movie Candyman, a hook-handed apparition keeps a lair in a crypt of vacant Cabrini-Green apartments. In the film, though, it's really public housing that is presented as the monstrous threat. Dolores Wilson tells a story about her brother, who worked at a nightclub on the Gold Coast, a 5-minute walk east from her. He said he wouldn't visit her because of all the terrible stuff he heard about her home. One night after work, when he was leaving the club, some drunk white guys jumped him and knocked out his teeth. "You won't visit me? I have my teeth. My family has their teeth." Dolores was sure to remind him whenever she had the chance. "You're afraid to visit me because of what you read in the paper? I'm not going to visit you from what I see happening to you." It's just like her to put a comic spin on things. But that nightmare image of public housing has a real cost. Once horror colors every thought people have about a place, the only responsible thing imaginable is to eliminate the threat no matter what. Acting out of fear, spurred on by a moral panic, seeing only the worst and nothing else, that leads to bad policy solutions. When I started reporting for my book at the end of 2010, Dolores Wilson's building was slated for demolition. It was the last remaining tower at Cabrini-Green and the last public housing high-rise not for seniors in all of Chicago. They'd all been closed and shut down and demolished. Cabrini-Green had seemed as immutable as mountains, as much a part of the natural landscape of Chicago as the expanse of Lake Michigan. Before Cabrini-Green was there, however, the neighborhood was an infamous Italian slum that had also seemed permanent until it wasn't. Public housing was supposed to save people there from the perils of the Italian ghetto's housing conditions. And now the towers were being torn down to save families from the prison of public housing. Today, as we just heard, we are in an affordable housing crisis that seems as urgent as the one in the 1930s and 1940s. Right now, only 1 of every 5 families poor enough to qualify for any sort of housing subsidy actually receives one. That means, if you think about it, 80% of our poorest families get nothing and are on their own. And this at a time when rents in cities are skyrocketing and the economic gains for those at the bottom have been slowest. Paying less than 30% of your income in rent is thought of as the threshold before rent starts eating into other necessities such as money for food and health care and education. Incredibly, a quarter of all renters now pay at least half of their income in rent. And I think we just heard that of low-income renters, it's 70%. The report that was just cited from our host, The Gap, as we heard, shows that there are only 35 available rental homes for every 100 extremely low-income families. Cities have inverted again. Inner city no longer is a pejorative, but it's actually the signifier of wealth. We're seeing more and more people who can't afford the housing there push further from the economic activity of city centers. We now have a greater number of poor people in suburbs than in cities. In 1937, the year the Federal Housing Authority was established, Franklin Roosevelt said, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, it is whether we provide enough for those who have too little." But it's stunning how we've moved away from that idea. An aversion to social safety net programs has rooted ever more deeply in the mainstream. Our current HUD Secretary, Ben Carson, has called poverty a state of mind. It's still true, as it has always been, that housing saves lives, as well as money in averting other instability costs if we have the foresight to see it. Without a decent home, without an affordable and decent home, none of the other issues of poverty can be dealt with effectively. No one is arguing for a return to Cabrini-Green style superblock public housing, but we must address the need for low-income housing more openly, compassionately, and smartly, without the fear or the stigma. When her high-rise was demolished, Dolores Wilson applied to get into a mixed-income building at Cabrini-Green. This replacement housing blends deeply subsidized families with market-rate and working-class tenants, as almost all of you know. This was touted as the remedy for the ills of concentrated poverty that define public housing. By design, however, the mixed income had far fewer units than the buildings they replaced, and only an unassuming number of public housing families, usually about a third of the total. The buildings, therefore, even at their best, are able to meet only a tiny percentage of the demand. Anyway, Dolores Wilson didn't get one. She was turned away. Most of her neighbors moved with Section 8 vouchers into the private market. They ended up largely in neighborhoods on Chicago's South Side and West Side that were also predominantly black and poor. The concentrated poverty and isolation of high-rise public housing didn't go away with the demolitions. It's just less visible now, and the problem is no longer literally owned by the state. Dolores Wilson had zero interest in a Section 8. After a half-century at Cabrini-Green, she didn't want anything to do with landlords or the possibility of multiple moves. She was relocated to a rehabbed mid-rise public housing development on the South Side. Her new unit is much smaller than her Cabrini apartment. The elevator is in my bedroom. I can sit in my living room and cook in the kitchen at the same time. She likes to joke. But her mid-rise, the building, has stayed in good shape. A security guard checks IDs at the front door, the elevators work, the stairwells are clean, the walls free of graffiti. What she misses most about Cabrini-Green is her community. At 89, as of this past weekend, she takes the bus Sundays when she can to attend her church at Cabrini-Green. One of her daughters moved with her to the south side. Her great-grandson attended the elementary school next door, but that school was closed in 2013. One of 50 public schools citywide that were shuttered that year, all at the same time. Dolores' daughter had had enough, and she joined the exodus out of Chicago, moving to a suburb of Atlanta. Since 2000, the African-American population of Chicago has fallen by an amazing 250,000 people. Chicago is also the only major city to lose population last year. And it's not in the city center. Dolores Wilson knows she's one of the lucky ones, though. The Chicago Housing Authority opened up a lottery merely to get onto the waiting list for either a public housing unit or a voucher a couple years ago. The CHA, as we know, is an agency known for dysfunction, offering housing long equated with danger and dilapidation. And yet 280,000 families enter their names onto this lottery. In all of Chicago, there are only slightly more than 1 million households. So 1 in 4 of them entered the lottery for a CHA home. In my many talks with Dolores Wilson, I've often asked in different ways why she stayed at Cabrini-Green. I have to admit, and this is the truth, that it was something I had trouble comprehending. She and her husband both worked. She paid more in rent as a percentage of her income and later as a percentage of her pension than almost all of her neighbors. I've come to understand that she never internalized the idea that poverty itself is a personal moral failing. She saw poverty as an injustice, and she saw it as something that collectively we are supposed to correct. She didn't escape the trauma of public housing either. Around the time she retired from the city's water department, one of her sons, Michael, who was then an adult, was outside at Cabrini-Green on his way to a Chicago Avenue sandwich shop. His girlfriend's ex-boyfriend started harassing her, and Michael got into a fight with the man. Dolores would say, with a mix of pride and sorrow, that her son was gallant. While the two of them fought, a guy with the ex-boyfriend pulled out a gun and shot Michael in the back at close range with a hollow point bullet. Michael died instantly. It seemed utterly unfair to Dolores Wilson. She dedicated much of her life to the community. Jack Kemp, the quarterback turned congressman turned HUD secretary, had himself named her resident of the year. Yet she didn't leave Cabrini-Green even then. Something she said 3 days after Michael's funeral stuck with me. She was asked if there was anything she wanted to convey to outsiders about her home. Tell them that there's more love over here than terrorizing. Thank you.
We have mic runners, and you can just call on people.
Yeah, any questions? Happy to talk. Yes, hi. I can repeat the question too.
How has mixed use, mixed income developments replacing public housing worked?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's a great question. The thing I said here, which I'd say first of all, it's such a tiny percentage that I feel like, so in Chicago during the plan for transformation when most of the high-rises were knocked down, it was touted as the centerpiece of the plan, and it was really misleading. It's just, it just can't handle the demand. So it's just a tiny percentage by design. If you have smaller buildings and you're only taking a third public housing, that's a really small population. So I think in Chicago now there are about 2,800 families who were in mixed income units. So that's, that's good housing, but it's small. It's a small number. Inside the buildings, there's been a mix of things. You could imagine, we've heard probably about some of the problems within the dynamics with families, that public housing families don't feel represented. Sometimes condo associations make rules that affect their lives. They don't have their own associations any longer to represent them. But I mean, probably like most people here, the vast menu of low-income housing that we need, I wouldn't dismiss any of it. It's like, let's add more to the menu and work on preservation. So we could think of ramping up all this stuff. But the short answer is that it's been a mixed bag, but it's also, I feel like, a little misleading in its promise. And especially in Chicago, where there was so much talk about ending concentrated poverty. Sort of this William Julius Wilson idea took over of these concentration effects, and everyone was embracing it. And this was the great ill that we were going to do away with, and no matter what. And people have probably heard about Chicago for its violence of late, and we have concentrated poverty and isolation all over the city. It's just that it's not in public housing. Yeah, it recreated it. Hey.
Okay. Quick question for you about the current administration of the Chicago Housing Authority. As a moving to work agency, it's been documented they've been sitting on close to $400 million in cash that could be utilized for vouchers. I'm just curious what the reaction of folks on the ground that you encountered in your research was to be quite frank, baneful neglect of the need of the city by the CHA.
Yeah. So, I think it was about 2 years ago, the CHA, Chicago Housing Authority, had what they called a rainy day fund that was something like $436 million that they hadn't spent on housing. It's raining right now, it was like raining. They have paid that down. So they've spent a lot of that, they brag about that, how much they've spent it down. Yeah, there was outrage, but I also think, one of the effects of getting rid of public housing is that there's less, there's less activism. JR could attest to this. There's less concentrated activism fighting for these issues. I think about New York City right now, and we're seeing sort of the backlash to NYCHA not having heat, and de Blasio can't go anywhere without people screaming at him. That's what happens when there's a huge population of public housing. Like, there's still this voice and this political pressure. That's something else we lose. We don't have Section 8 families who can mobilize together. So we lose that collective voice as well. Yes?
What was the extent of public housing? Vic.
He's going to give you a mic right there.
Oh, sorry. What was the extent of displacement of public housing families in Chicago, and were they guaranteed the right to return? If so, how many were able to return?
Yeah, so those who were living in public housing at a certain date in 1999 were given the chance to return. A right to return, not necessarily to the same site as where they had lived before, but it took a long time to build housing. People were displaced in a rush. There was this rush to knock down the homes. There was also sort of a calculating of who was least compliant and who wasn't. So many people were knocked off the rolls. By the time things were worked out, many people had died or just got lost. And once the CHA started looking inside these buildings, there were problems that existed in there that they hadn't even addressed. People had such needs that didn't even have to do with housing. Like in the same way of like our legal system, we had dumped people with mental illness, drug addiction, depression, all sorts of things that they needed multiple counselors. So there were problems that they were ill-equipped to deal with at first. Those families, so that was 1999. I mean, it took. Some of those families were lost. The CHA has a calculation of where they all went. Thousands that they just lost track of. There was this ad they ran in the local newspapers that read something like a list of names, If any of these 3,000 families, if you know anyone or you've read this, can you please get in touch with us? You have a right to return, but they had lost track of them. I also think that for the violence in Chicago, there has been a tendency to blame public housing families. This idea of like their ghetto, they brought their ways with them. I'm from a neighborhood called South Shore, which took on the most Section 8 vouchers, and there's constantly blaming those families for all the troubles. Many studies have shown that that's not the case. Even the idea that most people moved, say, back in 2000, 2001, 2002, and you would still blame those problems on them. Really what happened is that families moved to areas where they were already starved of resources, where there were already these multiple problems, and certainly it exacerbated them, fighting over for the limited resources there were. But if you look at like overlays of maps of where families moved, it's the same maps where the foreclosure crisis hit the most, where schools were closed, and where depopulation has occurred. Yes. Hey.
Yesterday we heard Richard Rothstein speak on The Color of Money, and first of all, I don't know if you've read the book.
Yeah.
I'd like to know what your comments are on some of his policy solutions. You seem to be talking about the importance of community, his policy solutions on desegregation. I'm curious how you think that overlays with
Tell me more about specific ones.
So, for example, in the use of tax credits, that these should be only in areas of opportunity and not in areas of concentration of poverty, for example. That we should be using those tools to desegregate in those ways. And I'm just wondering how that plays into the importance of community that you've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's certainly true that we've seen, that Section 8 vouchers have recreated some of the segregation they were supposed to solve. It's certainly true in Chicago, and it's certainly true in many places. And just, how a Section 8 voucher works, first of all, the amount of money, and as prices have gone up in opportunity areas, they just can't afford that. We actually tried something in Chicago called super vouchers, where they gave residents even more money to afford in better neighborhoods with better schools and closer to opportunity. And once it was discovered there was such backlash, this idea that poor people would get these thousands of dollars rather than hundreds of dollars, that the program was canceled immediately. The truth is that costs more money, to try to solve in those ways. It feels like such a multiple-pronged solution, meaning those neighborhoods itself where people are moving need to be invested in. One of the things I've been hearing a lot, and I had a conversation with Rahm Emanuel recently, but I think it's true also how we think of, a lot of economists think about the country and the world this way, that we take an average of things, and we, on a whole, on an average, you could say a city is doing really well. And with such, economic difference right now, if 10% of the population is most of the wealth, and if you take an average, the bottom 90% doesn't care that the average is pretty high or higher than it was 30 years ago. So, in Chicago, that's a perfect example. Rahm Emanuel talks about the schools being better than they were years ago, but that's in certain areas, and the vast land of the city, and especially on the far south side and the west side, are just starving for resources. So it's also investing in those areas, but also in the resources that if you're going to do a housing program, it needs to come with all sorts of services and the investment to move into those opportunity areas. You can't just say that magically. It costs more money to do it. Sorry, I'm sort of looking here.
So I work a lot with the homeless vets, HUD VASH, Section 8. And one thing I've come, because I do credit counseling, budget counseling, employment counseling, case management, and the one conclusion I've come to is there's a lot of people out there in low income and that they don't know another way to live, that it's passed on generations and generations and they've never lived a different way, and they've accepted that, unfortunately, as their role in society. And do you feel that you saw that when you had the boots on the ground? Because trying to change their way of thinking, that doesn't have to be like this, seems to be my battle. because I always have repeat clients, which is the worst thing you can have when you're dealing with poverty and housing crisis. So do you feel that we need to start from the bottom and change their way of thinking before, is that the first step to getting out of this crisis?
I don't think it's the first step, no. Meaning that, we still wrestle with this idea of policymakers sit in rooms and they try to decide when they come up with a program whether it should be limited to a certain number of people, whether it should have time limits, how do you reproduce it for others? This is something that is, in all honesty, we still don't know. We struggle with. For the problem that you're saying, and certainly I think there's the knock on dependency, which we also see become stigmatized and exaggerated, is also true. And in some cases, and so there's some blending of that. But I think of Dolores Wilson, who was such a powerful contributor to this community, but also never thought about leaving. So do I think the first policy solution is to tell someone like this that there's somewhere else to go, like this is a step up? As I said about Chicago, there is, and we just heard this report, The Gap, there is no next step in terms of housing, right? So even to say we want to subsidize you and teach you a way to then you can be on your own, but where do you go next? There is no low-income housing. There is no supply. And so it's hard to imagine that's the first step when there's not even the second step to move to. So, but I also think that's an honest approach of boots on the ground, seeing that there are problems even with our programs like that. One of the things that the left has to wrestle with when we think about these programs, we have decades and decades of proof of doing this really badly. And so if you're on the right and you have sort of this knee-jerk reaction to many of these social safety net programs, you have a lot of evidence to point to. When I talk about the CHA and I'm kind of knocking it, that's also the deliverer of the housing units that I hope would come. And the same thing when we talk about HUD. That's not some magical other out there. That is actually the mechanism we have in terms of government. And so we also have to think about we want to do it more and bigger but better. That's not a strong enough argument. So these are things we're still wrestling with. Yeah.
Hang on.
Oh, sorry.
Coming around. I can hold it.
My question actually riffs off of what you just said. You said nobody's advocating for the return of high-rise housing, but didn't we set it up to fail? To your point, there were hundreds of millions of dollars they were sitting on. So basically, they could have fixed the roof, they could have maintained it, they could have provided services. What's your view on the question of whether high-rise housing could work if the proper resources were provided? Do we necessarily need to dismiss it, or have we just basically set it up to fail so that we can say it doesn't work and we're just going to go on to the next solution and say that doesn't work either?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly when we think about all the arrows in the quiver, preservation is a huge one. We still have the supply, not just of 1 million public housing units, which we have to preserve, but all sorts of other opportunities. So there are many ways that it was set up to fail. In Chicago, maybe most of all, that all aldermen in white neighborhoods after white revolt, they were there is no public housing going up in these neighborhoods, and it really. Already an incredibly segregated city, even more so by public housing. The actual public housing formed the boundaries in concrete and steel. I think there are the idea of 23 concentrated towers without through streets. We would think architecturally we could do something better. That's what I mean. I don't think there's an idea like a high rise that you can make that happen. So we have arguments in Chicago, when it's useful for the city and developers to say no 100% public housing. And even low-rise developments that are in affluent neighborhoods are being closed. The ones that are far away are still okay. So I think the argument for 100% public housing is a different argument than saying, what about super block public housing? I think we can make a strong argument for traditional public housing that has 100% public housing families. You can manage that, and I talked about where Dolores Wilson lives now. It works, but I think there are design elements that we wouldn't do again. We wouldn't think about not having through streets and sort of the ways that it's cut off. That kind of modernist thinking has been abandoned all over the place. Although the opposite, this sort of New Deal, Jane Jacobs ideal has also been embraced far too much as a solution like that. You know, you don't have to go all that way. Thanks. Great.
Thank you very much for your analysis and your scholarship. In the 1990s, I was part of a group of people who did not live in public housing who worked directly in solidarity under the leadership of women in public housing or Hope 6. So I want to open up kind of an uncomfortable issue of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has been the fangs in the jaw around austerity and neoliberalism in public housing. So as we who want to organize for the human right of housing for all people, how do we navigate the fact that the Democratic Party has really fueled the ideology of poor people hatred and racist scapegoating in the housing world? Thank you.
I brought up Jack Kemp. When Jack Kemp was Secretary of Housing under the first George Bush, he said he refused to be the Secretary of Demolition. And then Henry Cisneros came under Clinton, and he was like, I am the Secretary of Demolition. And even in my interview with, when I spoke to Rahm Emanuel a couple weeks ago, he started talking about himself as a progressive. And I had the opportunity, because of the setting, I was like, well, hold up. You know, I imagine you, Rahm Emanuel, the way that you just characterized him, and I said that to him. Like, I felt like when you guys came into DC in the 90s, like these, you know, policies that we felt were important, you sort of stripped away. So, I mean, I think there is this huge problem that there is no Democrat that doesn't think that he or she is a progressive. And that term is also, is empty in meaning because of that. You know, but those are the, you know, when I think about in here, and I heard, how do we convince people? Like, those are the people that need convincing, that there still have to be allies of sorts. But that's the battle. I mean, but I think you're right in pinpointing that that's been felt like an adversarial relationship. And certainly when we think of, like, you know, everything has to be a private-public partnership. That's what I hear from Democrats all the time and leaders. And there's a reality to that. When there's no, you know, money coming in the federal government, from the federal government, like, you start to think creatively. But it's also not thinking imaginatively about the possibilities that are not in front of you, about recreating the system. Hey, go ahead.
What do you see as the role of the Public Housing Authority today? It has changed a lot, and the decentralization of affordable units is a good thing in some sense, but you mentioned how it makes it harder for folks to organize and build communities. So how does a Public Housing Authority address that today?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're, you know, I think of, like, the Chicago Housing Authority, and in a way they're way more nimble than they ever were. And I mean, that's also because they don't, you know, actually manage any of the properties, and there's a smaller number of units. But also the idea of managing 3 times as many Section 8 apartments, if that was really being done effectively, you know, think how difficult that is to check on all those landlords, you know, to check in on the residents. So I think that's a place where we still haven't really figured out how to manage that system. If that's what we're looking at, like, say, even in sort of pie in the sky, like a universal voucher program, you know, that kind of managing would take a completely different work. Sort of being more nimble, so, like, you know, the things that housing authorities are doing are looking for these public-private partnerships and sort of, you know, making smaller developments. You know, in Chicago, it's like, co-placing a new development with a library, or using some land and giving it to a grocery store and a food desert and then using that to build housing elsewhere. And certainly the thing that they're doing most feels like rad. You know, that's sort of the big push. I think I have time for one more question. I just saw a sign.
So one of the things that struck me when I was on the side of Cabrini-Green last summer was just how close it is to downtown, and the area is completely gentrified. It's these large open ball fields. And so my question is, you know, there's the frustration among the former residents in not getting units in that new housing that was built, but I'd be interested to know what you heard from former residents about the displacement and frankly the substitution, that an entirely different group of people came in and benefited from the redevelopment in this land grab. Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, because of its location, the talk of land grabbing had been going on for 40 years. That's like, there was like this talk of waiting for it to happen, you know, like the suspicion that it was going to happen. They're pissed, they're angry. They said it was coming and it did come. Exactly what they thought, you know, like that element. I mean, you could talk to JR, who was a resident and fought, you know, passionately and called out these issues. But exactly what you're saying, it is prime real estate, some of the primest in the city. And like I said, it was an anomaly that public housing came there. And so the sense that it would be cleared of it mostly doesn't feel like a surprise, but it feels like a real loss in many senses. Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it.